Welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us. This is our third expert session as part of the Strategy Lab cohort that the Learning Accelerator is running. And we're really excited today to have Christina Pate from WestEd talking about reopening schools guidance, supporting well-being and connection. It's going to be really powerful, I think really helpful and timely certainly as well. For those of you who are on the call who are not fully aware of what this looks like, these sessions are part of the Always Ready for Learning initiative, specifically the Strategy Lab cohort. We've got 7 districts around the country who are a part of this, doing long-term planning around equitable and resilient learning model design, as well as getting support in this moment about back-to-school needs. So we've got 7 districts, a number of whom are represented here today. I will flag that we might not have everyone today because school is starting in certain places. We were just chatting with Dr. Nunez and Superintendent PK from Monterey, California. They started a remote partially this week. They start fully on Monday. Our thoughts are definitely with them. And also just want to flag that Cedar Rapids team will not be joining. Unfortunately, Cedar Rapids had a Derico, I believe it's called, which is a windstorm that is like a hurricane. They unfortunately have, I think 25 of their 32 buildings were seriously damaged. All buildings in their school system were damaged. They've been out of power for at least a week now. I think John Rice said he was throwing out his refrigerator contents just yesterday. So they're unfortunately dealing with that in the midst of everything else we're all dealing with. So they will not be joining us today, and certainly our thoughts are with them. They have delayed indefinitely the start of their school year. So definitely thinking of them in this moment. In terms of who's here today, Cedar Rapids were the only ones actually thinking of starting potentially in a partial in-person situation, and all of us are going to be starting remotely, which seems to be the trend, of course. But that's just for a little context. And specifically today, we're joined by Christina Pate from WestEd. If you haven't heard of WestEd, they're a nonpartisan nonprofit research development and service agency. And they work with education and other communities around the world. And they're focused on improving education and outcomes for children, youth, and adults. And Christina specifically, and Christina, I hope I don't butcher your bio here. I'll do my best with this, but there are a lot of bullets to go through. I'll try to keep it succinct, but she's a senior research associate at WestEd. She's also the deputy director of the U.S. Department of Education's Center to Improve Social and Emotional Learning and School Safety. She previously served as a technical assistance lead for the National Institute of Justice's Comprehensive School Safety Initiative in Atlantic Public Schools, among other roles. She's got extensive experience in education, public health, wellness services, and service systems, and a range of expertise in strategic planning, systems thinking, social emotional development, mental health, leadership, organizational climate, et cetera. And she has a PhD in school psychology. And so she supports the work at WestEd to be fostering adult well-being, cultivating stakeholder voice, centering equity, promoting trauma-informed practices and resilience, and improving cross-sector collaboration. So that's a mouthful, Christina. You have quite the resume. We're really excited to have you here. But I'm going to pass the baton to you. You can correct anything that I shared there about yourself, and then I'm going to share the slide deck, and you can direct me as we go.
That sounds great. That's basically my entire bio. So thank you for being so gracious about that. I am so delighted to be here with you today. You can go ahead and share the slides, Nate, whenever you're ready. And before we jump in, I put a link in the chat box to some guidance that I'll refer to many times today. We've been sort of working on not just grounding our conversations in science, but also in conversations with many, many stakeholder groups over the last several months. So been talking to students and families and community organizations, school staff and school leaders, and a lot of state and county and local agencies across sectors in education and health, public safety, justice. So a lot of what I'm going to share with you today can be found in that guidance document. It's very step-by-step, but I think what is the best part of that document are some of the really great resources that are in there that are often a little challenging to find out in the field. So that link is in there. I also realized that we're all in different places in terms of either planning or launching, hybrid or remote or in-person sort of scenarios. So we're all sort of in different places. So just recognizing and honoring that. So anything that I say, try to be thinking about how we can adapt to whatever situation that we're currently in. So let's get started. We'll go through some foundational principles first, and then we'll dig into these key actions and steps that are organized by 3 focus areas. And then I have some resources in there. And I think Nate shared the PDF version of these slides with you. So if you need them for reference, or you can always contact me after this as well. So 2 crises, varied experiences. You can go to the next slide. We have what we're calling a tale of 2 crises here. So we're not just reopening schools coming back from a pandemic, right? We're coming back during a time of social upheaval and racial reckoning from the injustices that have occurred across the country. So during this time away from school, for many of us as individuals and certainly as a collective, our anxiety and our fear and our stress, and for some, our grief and our rage has really increased, while our proximity to our support networks at school and after school has really decreased. And it's not true for everyone, but collectively that's kind of what we're hearing. But we do know that for many students and for staff, some of them actually thrived during this time away from school because school environments may not have been safe and supportive places before the pandemic and the social unrest. And we know that many students have actually found a real sense of agency and purpose and leadership during this time. So these are the things that we want to think about and really want to consider as we are returning to school and as we are really rethinking this new normal. You can go to the next slide. So we know that there is enormous urgency to plan for a strong start to school, but it's also true that we have this unique opportunity during this challenging time to really put our schools and our school systems on a path to doing better by the students in our care, right? So for the sake of time, I'm not going to dig into each of these 3 right here because we're gonna get into each and one of these. So let's go ahead and go to the next slide. In the context of great uncertainty, I mean, right now, obviously the last several months, but even moving forward, there's also this enormous urgency to plan for a strong start to school. And a lot of schools and districts are really tempted to focus first on academic performance. So all of that unfinished learning or the learning loss or the credit recovery, right? But we do know from science that well-being and connection are actually prerequisites to effective teaching and effective learning. So schools really need to be building conditions for healing and learning that really promote reliable, responsive relationships that offer more inclusive, safe school climates and really provide for those rich, rigorous instructional supports. And the concept of addressing conditions for healing and safety and connection really goes for teachers and other adults in the school community too, because many of the adults have been navigating a lot of adversity and stress, whether it's caring for their own loved ones or they've been navigating job uncertainty in their family, and of course, worrying over their students. And as adults, our health and well-being has real intrinsic value. You know, some of us dismiss self-care because we think it's about spa treatments or beach vacations, and that's certainly one way that we can all relax. But it's not really what we're talking about when we talk about self-care, or we hear a lot of folks say that they don't have time for self-care, and they tend to be the people who really need it the most. So there's a lot of definitions out there, but really thinking about providing adequate attention to your own physical and psychological health and wellness, and really taking an active role to preserve or protect or improve your health and well-being. Because in many helping professions like doctors and nurses and counselors, it's actually considered an ethical imperative, self-care. And I believe that educators really fall in that category too. So this means if you can't show up in a present, healthy, positive way, even with the best of intentions to be helpful, it can actually be harmful to yourself, to your colleagues, and certainly to your students. So we have a self-care for educators brief and an archived webinar if that's of interest to you. And some of those resources can be found at the end of the slides under the resources section. Next slide. So really our North Star is focused on creating safe and supportive relationships and environments. So as I said, for some, school was a place where this happened. So there was a real loss when schools closed, both for students and for staff. But for others, it wasn't a place where this happened. So what do we need to reconsider and rethink and revise as we reopen? Next slide. So the CCSSO guidance that I put in the chat box, it offers some really tangible action steps and aligned resources in key focus areas, but it's really grounded in 4 key principles that are both foundational to and really woven throughout the guidance. And I'm telling you, if we don't address these foundational issues, we really can't effectively or sustainably start to shift practices and policies. So let's go ahead and dig into those now. So the first one is, when we're teaching students or even as leaders, when you're working with your staff, educators can engender safe and supportive environments that improve our ability to teach and improve our students' ability to engage and learn. So regardless if you're going back to school in person or remote or some hybrid form of that, I really encourage you to consider one important process. So this simple 3 R's framework that's offered by neuroscientist Bruce Perry can really guide our efforts in a trauma-informed way. So that's regulate, relate, and reason. So Perry suggests that educators should closely follow the process of how we reach what he calls the learning brain. So it's beginning from the back of the brain and moving towards the front. So in this order, we want to ensure that students and staff are first and foremost regulated in what we call our reptilian brain. So it's in the back and the bottom parts of our brain. So in order for us to effectively learn and thrive, we have to first feel physically and emotionally calm and settled. So that's the regulate part. So we want to help students and staff find ways to return to school and feel grounded and centered first before we try moving into anything else. And then once we do that, we need to feel socially and emotionally connected through safe and supportive relationships that are attuned to people's needs. So that's the relate piece. So this happens in the middle parts of our brains. It's also known as the limbic brain or our mammalian brains because it's what makes us mammals. It's where we have the capacity for connection, really. And once we're calm and settled and we're connected in healthy and supportive ways with other people, then we're finally ready and able to engage with formal instruction and with classroom learning. So that's the reason piece. And this happens in the top and the front parts of our brains or our neo-mammalian brains. It's what makes us human. So you can see if we try to jump straight into academic teaching and learning, we have completely bypassed what our brains need to actually get there. So if staff and students are showing up dysregulated because they're stressed out, because they're unsettled, or because they're feeling disconnected from safe and supportive relationships and environments, we won't effectively or sustainably reach the learning brain. So we have a brief on what we call trauma-informed distance learning that's organized using this framework. It has lots of specific examples in there that you can modify for in-person settings, and you can also modify it for your work with your staff for adults. So again, that can be found at the end of the slides. And we'll be going through some of those strategies more specifically here in a bit. Next slide. Our next one is around around anti-racism and cultural responsiveness. So even with the urgency of planning for a strong start to school, districts and schools really need to seize this moment to do better by all students. So we know in too many cases that the data show that schools have not served many students well, and it's most often those from under-resourced communities or students who are immigrants or those that are designated as English learners or our students with disabilities, and especially our Black and Brown students. So again, all of these points need to be conveyed and emphasized with your staff, with your fellow leaders, so they understand how all of these actions and steps really need to be enacted through this lens. So fostering well-being and connection has to be done hand in hand with the work of transforming schools to be anti-racist. So some of you may have heard this quote by now, but Dina Simmons from the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence has said that unless the systems of oppression that impact our students, our families, and our communities are acknowledged, then social and emotional learning runs the risk of being white supremacy with a hug. So in other words, if educators ignore the current and long-standing impacts of systemic racism, then we can never fully address the social and emotional needs of all students and really dismantle those biases and injustices that really exist in our education system. So someone who has worked with schools and districts for over 15 years, I can tell you many of you accept, but you often avoid having these conversations because they're tough and we don't know where to start. So I believe that we're really at a critical cultural inflection point where we have your ears and we have the ears of your staff and really the motivation to take action on these. Next slide. So the next principle is to really leverage data and input from all of your stakeholders. So we're asking leaders to engage in a process of ongoing reflection, continuous improvement that really leverages data and input from the entire school community. You know, we're really in a risk-averse system. We're sort of afraid of failing. And in fact, we're often penalized when we do, right? So if we can really start to think of continuous improvement as opportunities to reflect on what we did well, leverage those strengths, and then go back to the drawing board when something didn't work as a natural part of the learning process, we can really improve in a more effective and sustainable way. So in order to ensure that this work is grounded in equity, we really want to make sure that we're working with disaggregated data. So to the extent possible, you want all of your data to be disaggregated by race, ethnicity, SES level, gender identity, sexual orientation, English learner status, immigration status, or different ability status. And this type of inquiry and reflection really requires you to ask as leaders, who is being well served and who is left out or harmed by our policies and our practices. So we really want leaders to commit to interrupting policies and practices and procedures that are either explicitly or implicitly perpetuating unequal outcomes for children, especially those who are furthest away from opportunity. And some of the resources that we have at the end, as well as in the CCSSO guidance, can really support this process. And I'll touch on one of those specifically here in a bit. And then last but not least, we have a focus on assets and agency. You can go to the next slide. We know that success is possible for each and every student when they are allowed to claim their agency, their self-efficacy, and their power, and they're able to really build on their strengths and their resilience with the unwavering support of schools and families and communities. So in order for us to achieve equity, individuals and systems must truly value all students, especially Black and Brown students and their communities equally. We have to really optimize conditions in which students, staff, and families develop and really work across sectors so that we can address those factors that influence success. So this involves identifying racism and homophobia and xenophobia and other harmful and exclusionary beliefs as actions, as forces really that create inequities in how resources are either delivered or how they're accessed. So an asset-based approach can really focus on these strengths, and it values diversity in race, in language, in ability, and in thought, really. So students and families are really valued for what they bring into the learning environment rather than being characterized by what they need or what they may lack. So we have a responsibility here to see where those opportunities lie and to really leverage those strengths and cultivate agency and leadership. Next slide. All right, so as I wrap up this section, I'm going to pause here in a moment for questions and insights. But here are just some overall guiding thoughts as we return to school, and then we'll get into some of these, what these look like in terms of actions. So listen first to your students, to your families, and to your staff, and then develop a plan in partnership with them so that they're equal partners. So where learning and supports are done with them and not to them or for them. You know, as leaders, we often feel like we have to shoulder the burden always, but an adaptive leader will really give the work back to the people. So let them identify what they need. Let them make decisions, and then work with them as equal partners. So they have an equal stake in the decision making, and not just in the success, but also in the learnings or the failing forward that's going to happen as a result. And then set up those conditions for healing and success. I ran through a few examples and I have a few more coming up, but make sure that students and staff are heard, they're feeling settled and safe, and they're feeling supported before we really try jumping into all that academic content. And then continue to reflect on our policies and our practices. Are they equitable? Are they inclusive? Or are they punitive and exclusionary and creating more disparities? And then continuously refine them over the year in partnership with students and families so that we can create an equitable system that really reflects the voices of all the people that are involved. So overall, the work is really to be approached as a data-driven cycle of inquiry and reflection in partnership with students, staff, and families. So let's pause there and see if there are any questions. I'm not good at paying attention to the chat box, so I don't know if anything is happening over there that Nate, that if you want to point me to at this moment. You can unmute yourself or type in the chat box, whatever works for you. I see white supremacy with a hug. We'll be thinking about that for a while. Yeah, it's a really powerful statement. I'm happy afterwards I can share the articles that that she wrote that kind of explain that notion a bit better. Very powerful. Any ahas that anyone had? Yes, I will definitely share those.
No, I just want to that first principle, listen first. I think we're so quick and as leaders to react, right, to situations. So it's just a good reminder to keep that framework and focus of listening first. So thank you for bringing that up.
Absolutely. And, you know, my colleague, she's the founder of Rise Colorado, Veronica Cressman-Palmer. She talks about how even if we're listening, we have to actually trust what we're hearing, especially from families. You know, we're often assuming that our facts and our reality is the reality, but families and students have their own perception, which is their reality. And so we really need to trust also what we're hearing from students and families. So thanks for pointing that out. Any other thoughts before we kind of actions?
I really appreciated you tying the principles to kind of parts of the brain. I wonder too if there's anything that's kind of at play about ways that our brains are impacted by the nature of remote learning. I think that there's been some conversation about that, ways that it can be harder to make connection. I'm curious if that's played into any of the research or some of the guidance.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I think we have so much to learn now that we're in this different format. So there hasn't been a lot of great research on distance learning, I think, to date. But one of the interesting things that comes out of the learning science is that we're quite literally wired for connection. So there's some studies that show babies sort of learning language, and they're able to sort of remote learn some words through a screen. But afterwards, that learning is lost. But when they're doing it in person with that same human that was on that same screen, but in person, then that learning sticks. So there is something about actual human connection that's really important. So how do we create those connections in the home for students while they're distance learning to either create connections in socially and emotionally supportive ways via the screen, but also, you know, in the home with parents, caregivers, siblings, and things like that. So yeah, that's a great question. Probably have time for one more question or insight, comment. All right, well, let's move on with that. You can go probably 2 slides up. Oh, no, you're right, area of focus, sorry. We'll stay there for just a minute. So we're gonna talk more in terms of areas of focus. So these correlate directly with that guidance document that I referred to. The first one is really around staff well-being and connections. So really looking at universal strategies for staff. So staff includes administrators, teachers, support staff, and other adults in schools. And we're focused both on the self and collective care of staff, as well as their professional learning supports that support not just them, but the whole community. And then the second area is around student well-being and connection. So this area really focuses on universal strategies for students as they return to school, and it's really centered on relationships, learning environments, and policies. And the last area is around these tailored student supports. So really focused on identifying and responding to the more concentrated needs of students who might benefit from more intensive or individualized support in ways that are both ethical and equitable. Okay, so now you can go skip the next one we'll just dig in straight to staff wellbeing, connection, and capacity. So the key focus here is to really make sure that the first thing we do as leaders is to schedule opportunities for staff to come back together, get grounded, calm, settled, and really just reconnect with each other. And if you've already come back to school and you didn't do this yet, it's not too late, but try to get something scheduled soon though. We really want to make sure that school leaders are planning opportunities that allow staff to feel safe and supported, and really to create ways for staff to heal. We can't jump straight into planning for the academic school year like all of us feel like this major pressure to do. We have to get calm and connected first. So this really requires us to acknowledge and affirm the widespread impact of stress that all of us have gone through the last several months, and for some, trauma or grief or rage, really that continuum of experiences. So think back to Perry's 3 R's, and in that order, that's really how we want to welcome staff back to school. So leaders can do this through a variety of ways, both virtual and in person if physical distancing measures are in place. So for example, you can have a staff retreat, you can do staff feedback forums, you can do meetings to check in on staff and just see how they're feeling. But also you can gather some input to inform your ongoing engagement and supports. Leaders can also survey staff, just short, simple surveys to get their input on what they need, both personally and professionally. And you might also design opportunities with staff to assess their own well-being and to really cultivate those self-care strategies. So the CCSSO guidance has several tools in there for staff to assess their own well-being. So I encourage you as leaders to encourage your staff to use them and to keep using them over the course of the year, and to really cultivate those self-care strategies sustainably over the year. And then we want leaders to share information with staff on how to access available well-being and mental health supports. So it might be medical care options like telehealth, or other things that are offered through your employee assistance programs or group health insurance benefits. So altogether, these things are really a critical part of ensuring that the work you do in all of the realms is sustainable for the adults in your community. So it doesn't just happen one time when we come back. Really think about opportunities that you can create that continue to happen throughout the course of the school year, regardless of whether you're in person or remote. And then we need to get a comprehensive look at needs of all the stakeholders so we can effectively plan for those professional learning opportunities. So we're going to want to review existing data on student experiences, both in and out of school, as well as some of the feedback that you've received from staff, either on previous surveys before schools closed, or maybe on some of those current surveys or input conversations. So you want to collect both qualitative and quantitative data on that. You might want to include things like chronic absenteeism data, school climate data, discipline data, attendance data, and again, making sure that those are all disaggregated for analysis so that you're finding those disparities in students' experiences and really creating opportunities to put in place for more equitable and healthy learning environments. And then we also want to ensure that the implementation of the professional learning plan is really integrated with any other broader professional learning plan that addresses academics. This is really important here. We've got to really start to create a more holistic view of professional learning. And then you'll also want to make sure to remember to identify and invite potential partners for professional learning. So these could include mental health providers that are in your community or other community organizations who offer these kinds of supports. if you're implementing a universal tier 1 screener, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit, it's a hot topic right now, then all of your educators, including teachers, school leaders, support staff like counselors, social workers, psychologists, everyone will need training and follow-up to ensure fidelity. And again, I'll discuss this more in a bit. Now, here's an important note. We really want to encourage our leaders to plan for and implement professional learning that includes strategies that address both mindsets as well as behaviors and practices, because we always want to jump straight into those strategies, like the how-to, just give me the prescription, right? But it's really essential that we work on those mindsets. So values and attitudes, beliefs, biases, relationships, then the practices will actually stick. And one way to emphasize this with your fellow leaders or your planning staff is that we as educators always get initiative fatigue, and we end up not wanting to do the next trending thing. And often the reason a lot of your evidence-based practices aren't sticking, sometimes it's because they're not relevant to the context, but a lot of times it's because the underlying mindsets of the people hasn't shifted. So it doesn't matter what we slap on top. If our beliefs don't align with the practices, then nothing is going to change. So some topic areas you might want to consider for professional learning might include school climate or foundations of social and emotional learning, or SEL, integrating SEL into academics, culturally responsive teaching, trauma-informed practices, anti-racist instructional practices, really looking at implicit bias and equity training, and some more non-punitive discipline practices. And the last thing we want to do in this area is really engage in that continuous improvement cycle to reflect and inquire. Most importantly, we must do this in real partnership with staff. Have them identify what data we need to be looking at. What observations do they have? What goals do they want to set for themselves and for their school community? So really let them be equal partners in the co-planning and in the co-refining process. Next slide. All right, so for the next area of focus, we're focused on student well-being and connection. The first thing that we want to do is review the data we already have. We have a lot of it. We're often focused on the deficits though, really think about those student assets and their experiences both in and out of school to really inform a plan for universal supports. So this is a place where we absolutely want to connect with other areas like academics or other sort of systems considerations things, because we really need to think comprehensively across content areas and integrate the planning and implementation process. This is also where we want to encourage you and your staff to bring in the voices and data from various stakeholder groups so that we can really have a holistic view of what's going on and what we want to do. Something we also want to be mindful about in our conversations and in our approach is with screeners and assessment tools. I can't tell you the number of requests I've gotten over the last couple months about just give me something I can do first thing when we come back to screen or assess my students. So here's what we want to say about this. If your district or school has the time and the resources to ensure that all staff are trained and they have this service capacity not to just screen all students, but the service capacity to serve all of those students who are identified, then we'll train all of our staff on a universal strengths-based screener. Strengths-based is key here, rather than on a more diagnostic tool like at tier 2 or tier 3. Something important to note here is that many universal screeners can contribute to pathologizing students or over-referring students to tiers 2 and tiers 3. So this is especially true for students of color. So these practices can actually create more disparities and cause additional harm to students and families, and inadvertently or inappropriately use those limited and expensive resources at tiers 2 and 3. So make sure your staff are trained appropriately, they understand the bias that exists in some of these assessment tools, and make sure that we're rolling those out with fidelity. So once you gather all of your data, then you want to begin planning for those universal supports. And if you end up using a universal screener, you will eventually use that information, but you won't have that right away when school starts. Now, in terms of planning, you will hear me say many times that we really need to bolster tier 1 supports, because when we come back, not only do we have less resources than we did before the pandemic, but we will likely have more students returning with higher rates of stress and trauma than we did before. So we really need to bolster tier 1, because tiers 2 and 3 will be overburdened and they will have less capacity than before. So I really want to emphasize to you all that as you're making those tough decisions about where to allocate resources, this will have your biggest return on investment if you do it well. And it will also serve many of those students that often get missed or they get misidentified. So as you're developing your tier 1 plan, really consider including things like school-wide structures and systems for creating those safe and supportive school climates. So that can include something as simple as daily rituals, like a morning greeting for each and every student. Also looking at co-developed school-wide norms or values with students and staff. So not in tokenizing ways or ways that keep adults comfortable, but really in ways that students and staff agree. Also, the school calendar should return to those positive, familiar celebrations like cultural holidays and student achievements. And many of those approaches can be adapted for online and hybrid modalities. Another thing to consider for universal supports is explicit instruction of social and emotional skills, or SEL. And then last, you'll want to review your resource maps so that you can identify those external resources that are available to you to really increase your school's capacity to create those safe, supportive, equitable learning environments. You know, several schools right now I know are collaborating with after-school providers, even if they're in virtual settings at this point, to take a more coherent approach to their students' experiences. So it's a great way to engage youth development organizations, sports and art programs in your communities, all of those nonprofits who can help sort of provide funding and support to your safe and supportive school climate work. So for the next one here, you'll want to pair students with staff and be sure to share those expectations for staff to reach out on a regular basis to check in informally on student well-being. And we want to continue to ensure that each and every student has a personal connection with an adult when school starts and throughout the school year. And you can make adjustments if those original pairings aren't a good fit. And we have more ideas and resources on doing that, not just in the guidance doc, but I included a really great one from Harvard at the end of the slides here. Another example is that schools can plan for strategies to bolster strong relationships, both in and out of class time. So advisories and homeroom, you can create daily community circles or mentoring programs, all of those family and community engagement activities, and of course, those before and after school programs. In terms of promoting responsive relationships, strategies are easily adaptable for in-person, remote, and hybrid formats. So for example, teachers and school leaders can check in on students or families, and they can communicate in lots of ways. Just make sure that it's warm and positive, whether it's over the phone, in person, over email, or over Zoom. And ultimately, we really recommend that communication is clear and transparent and shows compassion for the challenges that our students and families are experiencing. You know, we spoke with a lot of students and they actually noted that this was a priority. They said they understand that leaders may not know what's going to happen tomorrow or how things will roll out next week or even next month, but having that transparency with them and letting them know that we're going to focus on what we can now and it might change again tomorrow is actually more helpful than not keeping them informed at all. They think they're being protected, but they're not, right? So they also expressed that they had a lot of empathy for educators. They realized that they're learning new technology and that they're switching all of their content to other formats. And many of them are at home with their own children. And they just feel like that demonstrating some vulnerability and being transparent was more important than actually getting it right. So just thought I would share some of those anecdotes with you. For the next one, so just like we did for staff, we want to plan a series of welcoming activities that both acknowledges and affirms the widespread impact of stress for students, but also celebrates a return to school for them. So social distance protocols might require that you convene in an outdoor space or virtually, But again, we put lots of ideas and resources in the guidance for doing this. And then last but not least, we want to begin a process of reviewing and modifying our policies and our practices. So this year's return to school really provides a unique opportunity to reflect on and adjust the way that we serve our community to ensure that schools are really, truly equitable places and anti-racist places for teaching and learning. So this key action really invites you to review discipline and attendance policies, look at those disparities, and really start to plan for a more non-punitive, a more inclusive, and a more culturally responsive approach. Some of the steps that underlie this action might include identifying or adopting more culturally responsive policies and strategies. They might be offering professional learning on implicit bias and race and equity. They also might look like prioritizing supports for schools who have poor school climate ratings, or maybe they have higher suspension and expulsion rates. And last but not least is really gathering and making meaning of all of that qualitative and quantitative data from all of those various stakeholders, and where possible, really engage your stakeholders in this data-driven process in partnership with them. You know, one thing that I always get asked is like student involvement. They're either tokenized or they're just completely left out. But students in developmentally appropriate ways can join adults in gathering and making meaning of data and really refining plans to make sure that it works for everyone. They can also provide essential insights into whether the return to school plan is actually working. So we can ask them, what are they seeing as evidence of healthy relationships and environments, and how can we measure that? And then together with all of your stakeholders, you can begin to refine your plan to improve it. All right, so the last focus area here is around tailored student supports. You know, first we really want to develop a plan so that students who need those supports really have an opportunity to thrive. So they're not sort of stuck in this tier 2, tier 3 forever, but really giving them the supports that can eventually be pared back. So we want to develop some decision rules that are based on our data from that universal data, so student surveys, school climate data, attendance, discipline, all of that, and really identify the students who may be most vulnerable. Again, there are steps in the resources that I provided here, as well as in that CCSSO guidance, around identifying and selecting an appropriate assessment tool for identifying students and for making decisions. One thing I want to strongly advise is that a district is the one that should lead this work in partnership with schools, rather than having individual schools trying to figure this piece out on their own. A consistent process across the district is most effective. As part of your plan, you will want to create a referral pathway for when student and family needs are identified. There are procedures for that outlined in the CCSSO guidance, as well as in some of the resources. But this type of system provides a streamlined process, both for identifying as well as ensuring access to appropriate services, and then also ensuring that they are implemented effectively and equitably. So when needs are identified, we have an ethical responsibility to respond in culturally relevant and asset-based ways. So screening cannot actually begin before we've identified what some of those supports are. Also, an essential piece of your plan is that, and it's something that is almost always left out, is to ensure that we have two-way communication with families and students on any sort of plan for supports. So allow families and students to self-select or to opt in or opt out as they choose, and also providing feedback on progress. This is really important. And then we want to communicate and collaborate with our community partners. So the relationship between schools and their community partners is so key, especially for these tier 2 and tier 3 services. So strategies for regular, clear communication should be put in place. Schools will also want to consider integrating providers and partners into regular meetings for planning, for reviewing data, for making decisions, and really discussing any feedback or evaluation. You'll want to revisit your resource maps to make sure that you're aligning your existing resources both within and outside your school system, and really making sure that you have the proper MOAs or MOUs in place so that you can share data according to HIPAA and FERPA and hold providers accountable for the services and the supports that they're providing. And again, we have some more resources in the guidance document for that. Especially important here will be to carefully examine your partners as well as that referral pathway data. So is that system working? Are students being appropriately identified? Are our methods of identification ethical and equitable, or are they creating more disparities? Are students who need supports getting access to those supports? And are those supports culturally relevant and effective? So keep asking questions, and as always, allow students and families to opt in, opt out, and do the work with them. All right, so I realize we're getting down to the last 10 minutes. So I'm not going to go through these key messages. They are there and they're like well written out if you want to review them at some point. But I do want to make sure that we get to a little bit of thought and reflection about actions and next steps. The next slide is just quickly a way that you can really build in some sustainability from an equity lens. These things called equity audits can be incredibly helpful. It's essentially a comprehensive benchmarking process that you can go through to determine if you're ready and committed to a sustained change process. And there are several examples that we have listed in the guidance document. I also put one of those in our resources at the end of these slides. Okay, so let's go down to action planning, Nate. Next slide. So I know that sometimes it can feel so daunting of a task. I went through a whole bunch of things that requires much more time than you have right now. I'm very clear on that. So we want to be thinking about the aspirational, but what are the small actions that we can take now to lay the foundation to really get there? It could be as simple as scheduling a meeting. It could be as simple as reaching out to a family. It could be as simple as pulling some data. So next slide, please. So I offered a quick example of what it might look like as you're starting to come back to school. So if you're listening today, think about what are the three priorities that you want to, the three things that you would like to prioritize from what you heard today. And then what are some small key actions that you could take as a means to work towards meeting those priorities. So as an example here, if I were listening today, I heard listen to students and families to understand their needs and co-plan with them. I heard creating space where staff feel valued, heard, and offered a voice in decision making. And I would have also heard reconsider policies like attendance and discipline with a focus on equity and inclusion. So you can see I've put in some quick action steps there. They're probably a little more built out than what's possible in the next couple of weeks, but gather your existing data and create that time and space. And then after you do that over the course of the year, you can start to co-plan and co-create solutions. Same with the staff, design and schedule a staff retreat and create opportunities for them to just have some community care and connection. And then those policies, I know those take time to make changes, but you can at least engage students and families and have them start reviewing those policies and give you some feedback so we can determine if some changes need to be made. So I'm going to pause there, take a moment, think about what are your priorities, and either unmute yourself or maybe share some of those in the chat box. So either priorities or things that you're going to do as soon as you leave here today. So we had someone say, I appreciated you naming the school is a different experience for different students, and some people found it a safe space and others did not. Exactly. So as you're rethinking of how you want to approach this new normal, what are some of those experiences and how can we better understand maybe what some of those experiences are and how we might shift? I think reevaluating the screeners and thinking about how we do make sure our staff are using them appropriately. Yes, and I'll tell you, the field is also at a critical point in this. I would say historically the field has not done a great job. Not a surprise, it's majority white middle class folks who are developing screeners, and so they have their lens on that. So they're really also at a point right now where they're trying to think through some of these more ethical and equitable issues. Any other thoughts? Priorities?
I thought that it was great that you also focused a bit on the staff as well. Like, I think that was, I feel like my immediate inclination is to go to students, and clearly teachers and staff also need some mental health well-being. This is a very odd time, so I thought that was a helpful reminder to not forget that.
Absolutely. If I were to say there was any priority, it would be staff first. Because we can't, it's like
one of the things.
Go ahead, Susan.
If I can jump in. No, I loved one of the things that that I really appreciated was that, well, you mentioned lots of different systems and so forth that could already exist. And so, for example, I've been in the district where I'm currently working for less than 2 months. And so a question that I'm going to leave this conversation with is going back, hopefully, to look at your slide deck to see what some of those key tenets are, and to see where we may already have places, things like that in the works, and where there are gaps, because I think the key thing is we don't want to design yet another system that has apathy in terms of implementation, especially right now when everybody's plates overfloweth. And so figuring out what we currently have in relationship to all of the different pieces that you shared with us that are backed by research in the current environment.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there's like this cliche saying now, like go slow to go fast or whatever. It's really, we're in such a panic and a rush right now to like get back and like have it figured out. But I would just encourage everyone to be patient and prioritize and let some things go so that you can focus on those critical kernels of things that we're going to take us further in more sustainable ways. So yeah, leverage the things you already have in place and make adjustments where needed, but you certainly don't want to reinvent a system if part of it's actually working well. So there's a comment, so thinking about how to make the environment a place to relate and regulate in the first few weeks when we are remote but at campus for our most vulnerable, but not fully doing until school the following weeks. Yeah, so if, and I can probably quickly put this in the chat box, but there's a link, that trauma-informed distance learning brief, I think can be really helpful. They're really simple, concrete strategies of how you can do this in a distance learning format, because we're thinking, oh, we can't hug each other and we can't give each other high fives, and there's just, how do we connect? But there are lots of ways that we can do this. I'm not saying that it's as good, but especially for those students where school felt psychologically or physically unsafe, this actually can create a sense of safety and regulation for them. So check that out. I'll try to put that in here really quick as well. I can pull that up.
Thank you for doing that, Christina. I know I want to recognize we're almost at time here, and just want to share a quick thank you to you for presenting this. I know this is a lot to take in, and there are a ton of resources here. I think doubling down on your point to start small and identify a few things you can do now and be willing to let go of some of it. But I think this is really some incredibly important work here that you've done, and that these districts will hopefully be able to benefit from, it seems like. So thank you very much. I would